This video was produced by the Top Cut. Be sure to check out thetopcut.net, your home for Pokemon TCG tournament coverage, professional game analysis, and interviews with the best players in the world. Thanks for watching. Hey everybody, this is Pooka bringing you another edition of Deck Breakdown, this time with probably the most controversial deck we have in this year's format, which is Durant. Now Durant is a pretty good deck to do a video like this about because for newer players it's pretty simple and inexpensive to put together, and the strategy is a concept that most people can understand pretty easily. So without further ado, let us take a look at the monster known as Durant. Alright, to start off, as always, we're just going to take a look at the deck as a whole, the whole Pokemon, trainers, and energy, and just get a good feel for what the deck will look like. Now, Durant is one of the more unique decks in the format just because you will see very few Pokemon and a ton of trainers and supporters, and then some energy too. Of course, you only have your Durants, and then Rotom, which is a staple as well, and then maybe you might have one or two other tech Pokemon, but for the most part it's just 4 Durant, 1 Rotom for your Pokemon, and then you have all these trainers, and then your energy, because you do need to attach to Devour. So this is the overall view of the deck. Now let's just start off by breaking down the Pokemon, which probably shouldn't take very long. Okay, here are the Pokemon in all of their glory. 4 Durants and 1 Rotom. Yes, this is pretty much all you're going to see in a standard Durant deck. Durant, of course, for each Durant you have in play, Devour discards the top card of your opponent's deck. So if you have 4 Durants in play, you discard the top 4 cards of your opponent's deck. That's the whole point of the deck. You deck them out, make them run out of cards, and you win that way. So you just try to get 4 Durants in play as quickly as possible, use Devour, and just kind of go from there. You have plenty of trainers to disrupt them and make sure that you can get extra Devours off, because on its own, Durant is very underwhelming. It has 70 hit points. If you're discarding 4 cards off the top of your opponent's deck, and they start with 40 cards in their deck, you're going to have to Devour 10 times with a 70 hit point Pokemon. That's not very good. Your opponent only has to take 6 prizes, and it's going to be tough for you to keep getting Durants into play because it only has 70 hit points. So you're going to need to rely on your trainers and stuff like that to keep Durant alive. And we'll get into that in the next section, but that's just kind of the synopsis of Durant. Not very powerful. It's just an uncommon card. It's 70 hit points. The attack is pretty underwhelming, but it adds up over time, and that's the point of the Durant deck. So there is Durant. You can use Vice Grip every once in a while to get a cheap win against a baby or a Dynamo, but that usually doesn't come into play very often, so pretty much all the time you'll be using Devour. Then you have Rotom, which has the power Mischievous Trick. It allows you to swap one of your face-down prize cards with the top card of your deck. Now, why is this important? Because Durant, Devour gets stronger for each Durant you have in play, so if you have one in the prize cards, you need to get it out immediately. And since you are not taking prizes with this deck, but rather trying to discard your opponent's deck, you need to use Rotom to Mischievous Trick and get that Durant out of the prizes if it's in there. Also, in a pinch, Rotom's Plasma Arrow can knock out some Pokemon. It's a nice surprise tactic to be able to knock out something like a Zekrom, which keeps Bolt Striking you, and really eliminate your opponent's only attacker in play so that you can get back to using Devour. Sometimes Rotom can be a game winner with Plasma Arrow, but most of the time it's going to be used for Mischievous Trick. So, the main point of the deck, keep using Devour until your opponent runs out of cards and you win the game. Pretty straightforward, pretty simple. Alright, and we'll move on to the energy from here. So from the Pokemon we move on to the energy, which are almost equally as simple. Of course you want to play Special Metal Energy because of its effect. When you have it attached to a metal Pokemon, it reduces all damage done to it by 10, making your Durant live longer, making it more durable. And then of course you need basic metal energy as well, because you do need more than 4 energy in your deck. So 4 special metal and then some basic metal And also you play a couple Prism Energy just so you can attack with Rotom in a pinch. Now you don't want to run too many of these because you will become vulnerable to cards like Lost Remover. If all of your energy are special, they can just keep removing them from play and you're going to be in a lot of trouble. So you want to have a good number of basic metal energy, but it's also nice to have Prism as well. So a good energy count for Durant is probably about 10 to 12. In this list there are 12 energy, just because I feel like being able to attach energy on the first turn is so important that a high energy count for this deck seems like a good idea. If you can manage to devour for 4 on the first turn, you are in wonderful shape. But say if you get all 4 Durants on the first turn and you don't have an energy to attack, well, that's a lot weaker. So I like a high energy count in this deck, but 10, 11, or 12 is pretty much acceptable for this deck. Usually you don't see people go below or above that, but this is pretty much a standard guideline. And from here we will move on to the all-important trainers and supporters, which take up a huge portion of this deck. Probably about 40 of the 60 cards are trainers and supporters for this deck, so we'll move on to that right now. Alright, so now we have arrived to the all-important trainer and supporter section, where in this deck there are 43 combined items and supporters for this deck. Now usually you have quite a few less than this because you have more Pokemon, more energy, but Durant, you only have 5 Pokemon and then 12 energy, which leaves room for a ton of trainers and supporters that you would not be able to fit in a normal deck. Now, what you do with these spots is actually pretty controversial because a lot of people end up varying these cards quite a bit. So I'll just run through the thought process behind what's in this list, and you can make your own decisions from there. Now, the obvious thing, you want 4 Pokemon Collector, so you can start off with one of those and search out your Durants immediately. That is the most important supporter in the deck by far. Just getting your Durants out immediately, and really that's going to be what you want to do as soon as possible. The quicker you have 4 Durants in play, the stronger your deck is. From there we have Twins, which is a pretty obvious card because you're never going to take a prize with this deck. You're always going to be behind, so Twins is always going to work. You're always going to be able to search your deck for 2 cards after your opponent has taken the first prize. So Collector and Twins, pretty obvious cards. Then we have Juniper, which is just one of the strongest draw supporters in the format. You discard your hand, draw 7 new cards. That's going to be important for refueling your hand because with Durant you need a lot of tricks in order to keep your Durants in play, disrupt your opponent, and prevent them from knocking out Durants in one hit. That's going to be the big deal when you're using this deck. If you can manage to make your opponent knock out Durants in 2 hits instead of 1, or miss turns of attacking, you'll end up winning. And going along with that disruption, we then have N, which shuffle your hand into your deck. Both players do, and then draw a card for each prize card you have. Now this might seem counterintuitive because sometimes you're going to end up shuffling cards back into your opponent's deck, leaving more cards for you to discard in order to win the game. But nothing is more disruptive in this format than N, because say your opponent is at 1 prize, and you play a Pokemon catcher and bring up a Pokemon with a high retreat cost, and they only have 1 card. That's going to allow you to devour, and they will have a very low chance of getting that Pokemon out of the active spot, and you can just end up discarding their entire deck while they sit there doing nothing. So N is a good draw supporter at the beginning of the game, and good disruption in the middle and the end of the game. And throughout the game, it's always going to give you 6 cards because you're not going to take a prize. So N, pretty good in this deck. I have 4 in here. I could see maybe running 3, but it's really good to have in this deck. Then we have the standard Oak's New Theory, which some people don't play in this deck, but I favor a really high supporter count in this deck because you really can't afford to miss a turn of anything with Durant. If you miss 1 revive, 1 turn of Crushing Hammer, something like that, then you're really going to be behind. So this deck plays 4 Twins, 4 Juniper, 4 N, 3 Oak's New Theory. That's 15 draw supporters, and the 4 collectors, and also plays 4 Pokegear. So this is about as consistent as you can get with any deck. 4 Pokegear, of course, will help you search out your supporters, and really there's not too many great supporters besides the ones in this deck. So those, you really just want Pokegear instead of more supporters. Especially because if you get like 20 supporters in your deck, then you really can't play them anymore. You can only play 1 per turn, so it gets kind of redundant. And you don't want that, so you'd rather have Pokegear. Now, we've covered the supporters, which are very important, but I think the more important part is going to be the trainers for this deck. So, if you take a look, we have 4 Junk Arm, which is pretty much standard in most decks nowadays, and then you move into 4 Revive. Now, Revive is going to be very important because every time a Durant gets knocked out, you want to get it right back. If you don't, your Devour is going to do less, and your deck is going to be a lot weaker. So you want 4 Revive just to make sure every time a Durant is knocked out, you can get it back and right back into play. So 4 Revive, pretty obvious. And now the big card of this deck is going to be Crushing Hammer. You flip a coin. If heads, you can discard an energy attached to one of your opponent's Pokemon. So if you can end up discarding energy from your opponent's Pokemon, you can prevent them from attacking, which means you can use Devour more often. So Crushing Hammer, most of the time, will end up deciding your games. If you get enough heads, you're going to win the game. If you get enough tails, you're going to lose yourself the game. If you go about 50-50, you're probably going to have a good shot of winning the game, actually. If you flip anything more than that, like if you flip 3 out of 4 heads on Crushing Hammer, you're usually going to have a huge advantage of winning the game. So, Crushing Hammer, by far, the most important item card in this deck. And usually you want to try to use your Junk Arms for Crushing Hammer if you can, because discarding energy is so powerful. If you can prevent your opponent from attacking once or twice during a game, you can end up just winning by that. Most games with Durant are decided by 1 or 2 turns of using Devour, where your opponent's left with less than 5 cards in their deck. So, if you can hit Crushing Hammers, that's going to help you go a long way. Now, in addition to this, the rest of these trainers, besides Super Rod, which is kind of the same thing as Revive, are all going to be about preventing your opponent from knocking out Durants every turn. Eviolite is a big one. It reduces all damage done to your Durants by 20, so things like Tornadus and Thundurus, which do 80 damage, will no longer knock you out in 1 hit. And stuff like Mewtwo is going to have a much tougher time knocking out your Durants when you have an Eviolite on it. So Eviolite is all about survivability, making your opponent knock out Durant in 2 hits instead of 1. Very important card in the deck. Then you have Lost Remover, which is pretty much like Crushing Hammer, except it works instantly if they have a special energy. So, most people by now are pretty well aware that they're not going to be able to use special energy very well against Durant because of Lost Remover. Now, there's only 2 in this deck because if your opponent gets greedy and keeps playing them, you do have Junk Arm to get them back. And most people are pretty smart about not playing Double Colorless Energy or other special energy down against Durant. So, 2 is enough. You can always search for it with twins if you need to. And there's always Crushing Hammer if you really need to get rid of other ones. Now, Pokemon Catcher is very useful in this deck for dragging up Pokemon that are kind of useless. For example, in Electric, which has 2 retreat costs, you want to strand it in the active position and then just keep using Devour. Pokemon Catcher will help you do that. There's only 2 in this deck because people have gotten a lot better with managing their bench, making sure they don't walk into this sort of thing. But you do need Pokemon Catcher still against Electric decks, so it's still in here. So that is going to cover pretty much all of the trainer section for this deck. There are a ton of them, so get familiar with them if you're going to play this deck. I've seen a lot of people play Dual Ball and Level Ball in this deck as well. I don't think those are the greatest cards for this deck. You would almost always rather have something else in your hand. And Collector is just flat out better than that in this deck. Now, Level Ball and Dual Ball also become absolutely worthless later on in the game when, if you're running like 4 Dual Ball, 4 Level Ball, and you manage to get all your Durants out there, just worthless throughout the rest of the game. So That's another drawback to them. And a lot of the time you have to draw a bunch of those things just to get your Durants into play as opposed to one collector. So devouring for 2 is not that great. So I don't think Level Ball and Dual Ball are worth the space in this deck. But if you like them, you can play those as well. But that's going to cover the trainer section. Now we'll move on to some tech cards that you might want to add into this deck. Okay, now we'll get into some tech cards that you could throw into Durant to maybe surprise your opponent and get some cheap wins. Now, most of these tech cards are going to have to do with really just surprising your opponent and knocking out their only attacker in play, or getting out a big attacker and sweeping them when they least expected it, or after you've devoured a lot of their deck. So, Durant, of course, has a lot of space for these cards because there are very few Pokemon in the deck already, and really, you can just throw them in because you have so much space. We'll break them down one by one, starting with Tyrogue, which is just sort of, 1, a free retreater, and 2, a way to get extremely cheap wins against stuff like Tynamo and other baby Pokemon. I've seen a lot of people feature this in their deck just because it's easy to go, okay, collector for a Tyrogue, retreat, and knock out a Tynamo and win the game. Hey, if they got the 30 hit point one, that's it. You can just get a free win just like that. So Tyrogue is going to be the first tech we look at here. Overall, probably not worth it, but it's an option just because it costs no energy to attack and it can get you a very, very easy win. Next up is Smoochum, which is a little more complicated. Smoochum, also a 30 hit point free retreater, and it's a baby. But it's used for its Energy Antics attack, which can really disrupt your opponent later on in the game after you've used Devour a lot of times. You can move energy from one Pokemon to another, forcing your opponent to have cards like Switch and actually have more energy in order to attack. So for example, if you're facing a Zekrom Electric deck and you catch out an Electric, you can Crushing Hammer, discard one of their energy off of Zekrom, and then use Energy Antics to move an energy somewhere else, making it tougher for them to attack. And then you can end up moving these energy to useless Pokemon like Clefas and Smeargles and stuff like that. So Smoochum is a very good disruption card, but the main thing about Tyrogue and Smoochum is that they're very risky because they only have 30 hit points. If you start with them, you're probably going to lose the game. If they are your only Pokemon in play. Sorry, I have problems speaking today. But yeah, 30 hit points. Most decks can knock that out on the first turn pretty easily. Then we'll move into Black Belt, which is a kind of unique card to see in Durant. Sometimes you get into situations where you can play a Black Belt and then attack with either Durant or Rotom and hit for a ton of damage and surprisingly knock out one of your opponent's only Pokemon. Like if they had only a Zekrom powered up and an Electric in play, you could end up using Black Belt, then use Rotom's Plasma Arrow and get a cheap knockout and really set them back, allowing you to devour more often and kind of get free devours where your opponent can't respond for a while. So Black Belt can be pretty useful, but it's also pretty situational. Seeker is pretty much the same thing. This is for when your opponent has very few Pokemon in play. They're too afraid to bench other things because they might have retreat cost, so they'll just have maybe one Tynamo and one attacker in play, and you can get another cheap win by catching out the Tynamo. Then you play the Seeker, force them to pick up their other Pokemon, and then knock out their Tynamo with a Durant Vice Grip. So these are all cards aimed at getting you very cheap wins in one way or another. Smoochum is a little trickier. It can win games that you might have otherwise lost, but the Tyrogue, Black Belt, and Seeker are all about getting cheap wins because Durant forces your opponent to play with very few Pokemon on the field, and you can just get wins that way. But now there's another type of tech for this deck, which is an all-out attacker. Now, these two are EXs, so they are very, very risky to play. If you start with one of them, you're going to be in a lot of trouble, just because they give up 2 prizes, and they're not really that useful on their own until later on in the game. The first one we'll look at is Mewtwo, which forces you to run double colorless energy. This is probably the biggest negative of running Mewtwo. You have to run double colorless with him, which you wouldn't otherwise run in this deck because there is no reason to. So double colorless allows you to use X-Ball. So later on in the game, you can end up playing an N, disrupt your opponent, and just start using X-Ball with Mewtwo, and you'd be surprised how often you could sweep somebody just using X-Ball. This is a card I've seen completely devastate people in Durant, because really, who expects a Mewtwo to come down? So that can be very useful. Unfortunately, you'll have to add 2 double colorless to your deck usually. The upside to that is you can actually get weird wins with Durant using Vice Grip. So double colorless, even though it's not that great in this deck, it does have weird uses sometimes, and so does Mewtwo. The other way is Shaman EX and Energy Switch. So basically what this will do is give you a surprise attack out of nowhere at the end of a game. Shaman EX has Revenge Blast, which does 30 plus 30 for each prize your opponent has taken. So later on in the game, this can do up to 180 damage, and because we already run Prism Energy, we can use Energy Switch, move an energy off one of our Pokemon, onto Shaman, just attach a Prism Energy, and start going at it with Revenge Blast. And same thing, you want to play N before you do that, maybe put an Eviolite on him, and he can just start sweeping through Pokemon. Shaman EX is a very, very dangerous sweeper at the end of the game, if you can pull it off. So, all of these Pokemon are extremely risky to run just because you run so few Pokemon in your deck, but the rewards can be extremely high. So they are high risk, high reward Pokemon to run, and it's really up to you whether or not you want to play them. They all have their pros and cons, and they can win games, they can lose games. The Black Belt and the Seeker, those are a lot less riskier because they're supporters. You can't start with a Seeker as your active Pokemon. So maybe those are a little safer on the tech side, but the more powerful ones are going to be Mewtwo and Shaman. However, they are extremely risky. So if you want to fit them in, go for it, but it's going to be a big risk. So this will wrap up the Durant deck. We've seen every section and some possible techs. If you guys have any feedback, leave them down in the comments. I'll be glad to hear it. If you want to see me cover any other decks, let me know as well. I believe I can do the Terrakion deck next. Otherwise, we've covered pretty much all the archetypes in the format, so that's going to do it for now. And thank you for watching. I've been Pooka here from the Top Cut, and I'll see you guys next time.